It's my great pleasure to introduce Eva Jablonka. Eva is very well known for her work on epigenetic evolution, which some people call Lamarckism, but that's a different issue. She's made a great contribution to our understanding in this area, and it obviously has implications for social evolution, socio-economic evolution. There's a last-minute change of title in her talk. As you see from her first slide, she's talking more about Evo Devo. I mean, she asked for that, and we agreed straight away. But I hope that change of title doesn't disappoint anyone. I'm very sure this will be very interesting. So welcome, Eva. It's great to have you with us. Please go ahead and start your talk.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting me. And, I think it's not a very formal kind of meeting. So if you have questions in the middle or something like that, please ask and interrupt me. So this talk is dedicated to the memory of Marion Lamb, with whom I worked for many, many years on many aspects of epigenetics and other related aspects. She died in 2021, December 2021. What I want to talk about is an approach which looks at the changes, historical changes in culture, in social organization, through a developmental kind of perspective. I want a system perspective, developmental system perspective. And the unit of analysis, when we're looking at this, when we're thinking about it in these terms, is the system of self-sustaining interactions among many, many different factors. They are biological, genetic, epigenetic, psychological, and they are social. All these resources input into the social system. And it's not just a social system. I mean, all this inputs also input into any biological developmental system, in fact. Of course, it will be very dependent on the particular system we have in mind, which processes and factors are more important, but they would all have some kind of impact. And the focus when you're thinking about when you're taking this kind of system perspective, is the cybernetic architecture of the networks that lead to some kind of convergent end state. So what we're trying to look is at what is responsible for the system's stability. Once we understand what is responsible for a system's stability, we can also understand what is sorry, do I have to do something? I get messages.
No, we can say I'm asking the guests to make sure that they press sync to presenter at the bottom of the screen, so that as you move your slides forward, they see the current slide that you're on. So if you're moving the slides, that's fine.
I'm moving the slides, yeah. Okay, so my starting point is trying to understand the kind of dynamic stability of the system. And once I understand this dynamic stability of the system, I can understand also departures from stability. So, I'm a geneticist by training, so when I'm thinking about a system, I'm thinking about a genetic system, I'm thinking about heredity, I'm thinking about heredity continuity. Yes, of course I want to understand variations, but first of all, I have to understand the inheritance system. And this is the basic, and this kind of, and the starting point, starting from the stability, or the stability over time, to understand the factors that go into it, this is something that allows me to sorry, I lost you. I'm very sorry. I lost my slides. I can't see my slides at the moment.
Okay, try the share button again. We can see you.
Yeah. I don't understand it. Okay.
It's coming up again, don't worry. So we can still see you. The slide should come up.
Yeah, okay. So, okay,
So
see the
they're
first.
loading up. Here yeah, click forward. That's fine.
Okay. Admit? I don't know. Okay. So, okay. So this is my starting point, and I'm taking Waddington's epigenetic landscape metaphor, which was built, which was constructed in order to understand embryonic development and the relationship between genetic networks and the actual phenotypic aspects of embryological development. And I'm trying to see whether I can, whether they can be, this kind of image can be useful for thinking about the dynamics of cultural systems. So you are all familiar with the notions of plasticity, and canalization. Plasticity is the ability, when we're thinking about genes, of a single genotype to generate variant forms of morphological, physiological, behavioral, whatever, in response to different environmental circumstances. And canalization is the adjustment of developmental pathways so as to bring about a uniform developmental result in spite of genetic and environmental variations. And an important notion that Waddington was talking about, especially in the 60s and the 70s, was the notion of an attractor, which is a point or state or a trajectory towards which a dynamical system evolves over time as a result of many, many different at many different levels, constraints at many different levels. So, and when he was talking about what he called the epigenetic networks, he was describing these networks in terms of interactions. So what he said about it, the way that he defined epigenetics was a very, very broad way. Today we qualify this in various ways, but he was talking about the branch of biology which studies the causal interactions between genes and their products, which bring the phenotype into being. And what he was interested in was in the network, the flexible network of regulatory interactions that underlies the stable trajectories of embryonic development. He was very, very interested in canalization. He was also interested in plasticity, and as we shall see, the two cannot be thought separately. One is dependent on the other, in fact. And here is a very, very famous picture of his. This is the epigenetic landscape, and he's depicting here in the top picture, the embryonic development as a kind of progression of a ball through a sloping landscape. And he calls it the epigenetic landscape. And there are all kinds of, and the final attractor is the adult state, but we can also think about the attractor as the development of a particular organ, or the final differentiated state of some kind of cell type. It depends. We can think about it at different levels and different ways. And what underlies the developmental pathways is a network of genes. And the dynamic, and what we're seeing in the bottom picture are the genes. These are the black pegs, and the strings are the effects of the genes, and they construct a network. And this network has very interesting, there are many, many feedbacks between the products of these genes and this strings. They create a network which is very flexible and is very robust in terms of its ability to withstand many changes without these changes leading to a change in the landscape, in the phenotype. So just a minute. Okay, so I also want to introduce another concept which I developed a long time ago, which is the heritably varying trait, phenotype, a heritably varying phenotypic trait. And this is a characteristic of an organism, a developmental characteristic of an organism or of a group of organisms. It can be physiological, behavioral, social, symbolic, whatever you want, which results from the interactions between internal initial conditions and the external environment. And it can take different forms and persist for different lengths of times. And we can think about it also as some kind of attractor state because it persists. And we can think about heart rhythm, for example, as being a heritably varying trait, or a food preference, or urban poverty, or a religious kind of persistent religious cycle, vicious political cycle, a ritual which is reconstructed again and again and again. It's up to us how we do it. Just a minute, I can't see the slides. Okay. Okay. So this is how he thought about it. Now, he was also very, very aware, although his focus was on canalization, he was also very aware, because he was an evolutionary biologist, he was very aware of change. Things change, so how do they change? If we have such very, very robust trajectories, but sometimes either the accumulation of many variations, which once they pass some kind of threshold, or a very large, if we think about genetics, mutation with a big effect, some kind of regulatory mutation, or a very strong environmental impetus change can lead to a change in development, to a new attractor. And if we can push this, if we're thinking about an environmental effect, we need the environmental effect to push the kind of developmental ball into a new trajectory. And if we want this to be genetically assimilated, we have to select all the variations, whatever they are, genetic. He was thinking only about genetic variations, but I would say also epigenetic variations that contribute to the stability of this trajectory. So, and this is what we're seeing in this picture. This is the picture. Both pictures are from the Strategy of Genes, which was published in 1957. Now, one of the things that a lot of people were complaining about when they looked at Waddington's pictures were saying, well, yes, all right, they usually don't look at this picture, the second picture, they look at the first picture, this one. This is the famous picture. And people, for example, Mary Jane West Eberhard asked herself, well, where is the environment? Because she's much more interested in plasticity. And in order to get to, Waddington talked about it, wrote about it, but he didn't depict it in a graphic way. So we thought that when I'm saying we, it's me and my colleagues, because I didn't think about it all alone, although the last paper that I published on it is a solo one. So when we're thinking about a developmental landscape, we can think about it, we can take a bit of this developmental landscape, look at a particular attractor, and look both at the underlying kind of networks and also at the overlying networks. So the underlying networks will be, for example, genetic and epigenetic, and it depends on the system how, as we shall see, what the underlying networks are, those that are under the actual landscape that we're looking at and trying to understand. And there will be also overlying kind of networks, for example, social networks that are also quite robust and self-sustaining and kind of regenerating. And together, these networks from below and from above, they construct the developmental network in which we are interested. And what we see here is a very small part of this big developmental network with a dominant kind of attractor where things sort of different from where you can get to the attractor from many different directions. There is an alternative attractor on the right-hand side of this network, but at the moment, there is a hill between them. It's very difficult to get there. It's actually quite impossible to get there if you start from the left-hand side. Or not impossible, but very difficult. You'll need some really strong impetus to get into this alternative attractor. So here, what is important here is that that both the effects of the underlying and the overlying networks construct the developmental networks. And both of these networks can be very robust. Now, how can we think about it? I know that you probably all know Waddington very well, so I'll go through this part very, very quickly. So I don't know how well you can see it, but the first one that on the left-hand side top that we see is the same network that we just saw before, only smaller. And what we have in the middle of the upper picture is a change in the upper part, the network, the top network. There is some kind, you see the organization of the network has changed. There is a change. This change does not impact the developmental networks. It stays exactly the same, but it does impact the underlying network. It reorganizes it. If we think about, for example, a climate change, and we think about an organism that develops when the climate changes, and it seems that it doesn't have any effect on it. Well, it doesn't have any effect on it at the development, at the phenotypic level, at the trait level, but it does have an effect. If we look at how gene expression changes, gene expression does change, and it buffers the effects of this climate change. This is exactly canalization. So canalization is dependent on the plasticity of the underlying network. Without the plasticity of the underlying network, we will never have canalization. It is dependent on this type of organization. And the same is true if we have a mutation. Let's say we have a mutation in the bottom network. This mutation doesn't have any phenotypic effects. It's completely neutral in terms of phenotypic effects, but it's not really neutral. It again leads to reorganization, it could lead to reorganization both at the epigenetic level, at the gene expression level, and it can lead also to changes, for example, in behavior that change the way in which the ecological niche, for example, that the animal is occupying. But when we're looking at the organism, at the phenotypic development of the organism, we see no change. Of course, the change can happen. For a change to happen, we have to lower the kind of hill that separates the major attractor and the potential, at the moment, very shallow attractor or almost non-existent attractor. And this can happen. It can happen when there is a big environmental change which has many effects that you cannot compensate for it, but you can change adaptively through plasticity. And this is what we see at the bottom. Or if there is a big regulatory mutation that is changing also it is changing the epigenetic landscape and the developmental landscape and is leading to a new attractor. So what is important to understand here is that we have a lot of stability, and it is not easy to get away from this, to escape this attractor states, but it is possible, of course. So this is the kind of framework that I'm thinking about. This is the kind of, when I'm trying to think about the system, a developmental system, a system that changes through time, I'm thinking in terms of this kind of networks, about development and about the networks that are underlying it and are overlying it. And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, so what is it that now I'm taking, I'm saying, fine, this is how I think about it as a dynamic system, but now I have to think more specifically in order to understand what goes into this developmental. And if we're thinking stability, if we're thinking about developmental stability that persists over generations, we're talking about some form of heredity. So what are the things that can stabilize the system, but also can make a difference to the system? The things that can both stabilize the system and make a difference to the systems are, of course, genetic variations in DNA, all kinds of epigenetic variations, both in the gametes, but also through variations in all kinds of other parts, also epigenetic variations that lead to the same kind of reconstruction of development, sort of kind of variations in the in the way that the system organizes self-sustaining behaviors. There can be also variations in niche constructed ecological legacies, in behavior, and in humans in symbolic behavior. So, okay. So when I'm thinking about it, and when I'm thinking about heredity, and when I'm thinking what goes into a particular developmental, what leads to the development of particular developmental trajectory, for example, some food preference. If we start very, very simple, then we can have genetic variations that are important. We can have epigenetic variations in the egg, in the sperm. We can have all kinds of other developmental variations that depend on what the mother eats and on the uterine kind of on what passes from in the uterus to the if we're thinking about humans or mammals into the baby. We can think about the early development, something that can, for example, determine a particular preference very early on through early exposure to certain foods, either liking them or being aversive towards them. And of course, later development, the whole cultural milieu in which we live, which is very influential on what we like, what we prefer, and what we eat. For example, if we're thinking about food preferences, what we decide to prefer, even if it can overcome even aversions in some cases. And we know this from there are many examples of this. So how do we think about a Waddingtonian approach to culture? Again, now that we know that we have an idea of what goes into the construction of a stable system, or and also what allows what kind of variations are allowed within the system, how can we think about it? So we have to, first of all, as I said, to figure out what are the persistent developmental dynamics of the system, so we can follow the historical change in them, or at different scales. And we're looking, if we're looking at social system, we're looking at social system that is composed of individuals, of groups of individuals, of institutions, and how they develop and how they reach their attractor is very, very important. So this is part of what we have to do when we're taking this approach. And the constraints of the system and the affordances that the systems allows, they're very, very important for forming the social attractive state. So here we are. We have a kind of social landscape. It's some kind of dynamic pattern of life in a particular community. And it's the outcome of developmental, ecological, social, epistemological niche construction. And a lot of things at a lot of levels, as I said, genetic, epigenetic, behavioral, cultural, socially learned things go into it. And the individual develops within this system and contributes to the collective and cumulative interactions that build up the social landscape. So we have trajectories where individuals sort of develop. They usually we are already born into a world with already existing trajectories. We tend to stabilize them, not always, but very often we do. But sometimes there are things that make us and with other people usually, almost always, create a new trajectory. And there are very strong social attractors. We live in we are very, very aware of them when we are thinking about prejudice, for example, and about things that are very, very difficult, desirable, that we would like very much to change, but are very difficult to change. Well, I'm talking I'm talking from Israel, when we are exactly in this kind of situation where we're trying to change a very, very strong and nasty attractor. Okay, so this is how we think about it. So this is very, very abstract. So I want to make it, to give you a few examples that will make all this into something a little bit more concrete. So I'll give you a few examples from very, very different domains of life. The first example that I will give you is something that I did talk about and did write about previously, but I think it's a very good example. The example that I want to, this example is the example of the persistence of urban poverty in the United States. It's a kind of cycle of deprivation that is being recreated and recreated again, very, very difficult to escape. It's possible, of course, and people do, but very, very difficult. And we know, for example, that children that are born into the lowest quintile, 20% of the social economic ladder, have only 1% chance to end up in a higher kind of rank on the ladder. And it gets worse the lower you are. It's very, when you come from a very underprivileged family, it's very, very difficult for you to get away from this kind of thing. And so this is something that we know, and there is a huge amount of work about this kind of thing. So how do we think about it in terms of a landscape? What goes into the creation of this system? What stabilizes this nasty attractor? And I'm talking here about something which is good for nobody. It's not something that persists because it is good. It is not good. It persists because there are all kinds of feedbacks within the systems that construct this landscape, this poverty, this attractor, this poverty attractor, that lead to its stability. And we have to understand what these factors are if we want to try and change it. So I will go back to this picture. This is the kind of very, very general picture that I have, but people are working and have been working on this quite a lot. And they are saying, when we're asking ourselves, well, what are the factors that go into this attractor? What is creating this undesirable, it's no good. We cannot say it benefits somebody. It benefits, well, you could say it benefits some nasty bourgeois capitalists, but I don't think that this is a good enough answer. Yeah, it's part of the answer, but it's not it's not the whole. That's not the whole answer. So I'm just giving you a little bit of this huge of what people are talking about. So they're talking about, for example, social structural factors, including the jobs available, the education of the parents, the quality of the school in the inner city, the structure of the state welfare system. They're talking also about biological and epigenetic factors. Biological here are not genetic, they are epigenetic. Where about junk food and the bad effects of junk food, about mothers' bad nutrition and sometimes taking toxic substances, about alcohol and drug consumption in this very poor, in many of these very, very poor communities, and also about violence, even violence while the mother is pregnant. We know this also from certain very poor areas. And there are also exclusion mechanisms that those who make it, those who escape the cycle, usually never return and don't want to have anything to do with the places from which they come. So this is another thing. And there is also the geographical segregation that poor neighborhoods are. That poor people are living in poor neighborhoods, and they are close to other poor people. And when you're thinking about the way that all these factors interact, you understand how they create a very, very strong self-sustaining kind of loop from which system from which it is very difficult to escape. So here, when we're looking at it, at the top, we're looking at the general social factors like the welfare system, the education system, the geographic segregation. When we're looking at the underlying network, we're looking at networks of epigenetic factors that are caused by junk food, by drugs, by lead in letter, in water, by violence, that are affecting the starting point of development of this of people. And all this construct together the the poverty trap. So this is one example. Now it's now there are other. So this is I gave this example because it is an example of something that is recognized to be not very good, and yet it persists. And there are many examples like that. I mean, we can think about female circumcision, for example. And I will give another, I don't know if I will give this example. I guess if I have time, I will give you the example of my own country when we are the persistence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But let's first look at another one, at the persistence and even the thriving, the deepening of an attractor of Orthodox Jews in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles is a very kind of progressive community, and very secular community, transgressive community it is. Beverly La Brea neighborhood I'm talking about. And in this very neighborhood live very, very Orthodox, very highly Orthodox Jewish community. And so how do they manage? How do they manage? How can they manage to sustain, and not only sustain, but actually to deepen their attractor, to enlarge it, to make it to? There are more and more people who become members of this community. It's a growing community. It's not mainly maintained. It's actually growing. So here again, we can think about it in terms of this kind of attractor. So I will just go again to the next slide, and then I'll come back to this one. So what are again, a lot of work has been done on that. Ida Tavori wrote a whole book about it and several papers into understanding what is going on at this, how does this community work? And there are many factors, but here are just some of them. So first of all, the neighborhood community affords members with the institutional framework that they need, and it generates participation, creates a lot of obligations that the members are all the time pulled towards. They just don't have time to do anything else very much. And so that's one factor. Because they're so similar to others, they maintain the boundaries by actively differentiating themselves from the others, by in the way that we're closed. And they also transform their marginality and difference into some kind of seductive experience of community. Here we are, and this is very important. And there are also geographic boundaries. They form them actively. And public worship situations create interactions which sustain the religious communal life and generate communal feeling. Okay, so these are just some of these factors. So let's have a look and see what no, that's the one, sorry. So here we are. So we are thinking about, so we have the Orthodox attractor in Melrose La Brea in this area, and we have at the bottom, we can say, is constructed by culturally learned shared psychological dispositions, which include a shared group Jewish religious beliefs, very, very strong belief systems that are induced and learned very, very early in development. And there are many, many, many of them. They involve food. They involve ways of what you can do, what you cannot do in many, many, many domains as an individual. And at the top we have the educational educational autonomy, geographical segregation, forging relationships with authority within the larger Hasidic community in the USA and also abroad, for example, in Israel. All these things also construct the landscape, make it very, very stable, because they are top-down constraint as well as bottom-up kind of effects. And together they create this kind of landscape. That's why it's very, very difficult for these people to become secular. Although they live in the most secular area that you can imagine. Okay, so this is another example. So this is I'm living in Israel, and in Israel we have There is a conflict with the Palestinians which is going on for a very, very long time. It's a very complicated situation. I want to look at the last 20 years and look at specifically at the from the Israeli point of view. This is very, very limited. From the Israeli point of view, I want to look at what maintains. Why don't we get to the from our why don't people try to have a kind of peaceful solution, agree to some kind of compromise and try to work it out. Of course, it doesn't only depend on the Israelis, but I'm now looking at the Israeli kind of at it from the Israeli point of view, at the kind of narrative that the Israelis construct that is leading them to remain. That is one of the factors that is leading them to remain in the conflict zone, which is a kind of comfort zone for them. So here we are. So some of the interacting factors, and people again have been writing about it a lot. And Daniel Bartal has written very important papers, and as well as several books about this. And what I'm saying now is taken from him, is based on his work. So when we're looking at the Israeli narrative that is part of the thing that is constructing this very nasty attractor, is people are talking. So first of all, there is the narrative of Israeli solidarity, which is very much increased following wars and terror attacks, and is combined with a self-perception always as an innocent victim. We are always innocent. I mean, we Israelis. There is a positive moral self-image of the Israelis. And, you know, we're a liberal democratic state, the only democracy in the Middle East, etc., etc. We are not like South Africa. We are not, no comparison whatsoever. There's very strong moral silencing of criticism, and people and other nations have no right to criticize us, because every criticism is anti-Semitism, and look at what you didn't do during the Holocaust, etc., etc. So it's the use of guilt. There is the rise and increasing impact of social, cultural, political influence of religious right-wing Zionism. I mean, if you're following the newspapers, you see what's going on in this country, absolute horror. And a small marginal group, because of the political structure in Israel, the way that we are, the way that the government is formed, have disproportionate power, and they represent very racist, right-wing views, which are during the last 20 years have been growing in impact. There are changes also in language. So things, go through kind of linguistic purification. For example, torture is called moderate physical pressure, and blockade is called closure, and targeted assassination is called targeted strike. And there is also concealment, falsification of information, and so on, and active reinforcement, of course. Also, there are people who benefit from it, by sector who benefit from these situations, like the settlers, like all kinds of economic, formal and informal institutions that maintain this narrative. So I'm not saying that this is the whole story. I'm looking at it from one perspective. It's not the only perspective, and it cannot tell us the whole thing, but it is a very important perspective. When we are looking now back at this attractor, at the conflict comfort zone in which we're living, of course we can live in this comfort zone because we don't pay such a very high price. The price is high, but it's not very high. Then if we're looking at what is underlying, the network that is underlying it is culturally learned and shared beliefs and emotions learned from very early on, including moral superiority of Israelis, collective fear, out-group demonization, which starts very early on, fear of risking change, which is a very general kind of phenomenon in many societies, and very strong in the right-wing Zionism bit of religious nationalistic beliefs. And at the top networks are the networks that reinforce this kind of thing, international, political, and military, because of international, political, and military interests. And together, these things form this unfortunate conflict zone. Okay, so now I want to talk about something very different. I want to talk about a theoretical kind of attractor, which is also difficult to escape from. And I'm talking about the modern synthesis attractor. I'm talking about the version of Darwinism, which is called neo-Darwinism, and also known as the modern synthesis. Neo-Darwinism was a term that was invented in the 19th century. Neo-Darwinism has come into being in the middle of the 20th. And it is a view that the modern synthesis centers of genes and decouples development and heredity, and assume that heritable variations are basically function blind, and selection is the only direction-giving process in evolution. Now, this is the structure, the basic structure of the modern synthesis, and there is at present some kind of challenge to it. So there is a very strong attractor of the modern synthesis, which is still very dominant. If you read the textbooks, you see it. And I'll just go to the textbook. I have looked at 15 of them, and it cannot be more clear, although there are, of course, variations. And there are some things that are put into little boxes. But on the whole, this is the kind of view that is depicted there. But there is nevertheless an emerging kind of alternative view, which is called, I don't like it very much, but it's called the extended evolutionary synthesis. I don't like the term. It's not that I don't like what is going on. I do, and I hope I have contributed and will contribute to it. But it centers on the developing. But the difference is that this kind of view of evolution, theoretical view of evolution, centers on the developing individuals, on the agency of the individual, and on the agency of groups, and on a broad notion of inheritance that includes not only the inheritance of DNA variations, sequence variations, but also variation in gene expression, behavior, and in symbolically encoded variation. Now, when we're trying to understand what is going on with this thing, we want to understand why, in spite of, for example, my view is that there are so many things that have happened during, I don't know, my lifetime, that should sort of rock this boat of the modern synthesis. Nevertheless, it is very, very robust. It is very stable. So what is this theoretical attractor? And how can we think about it in terms of this landscape model? So what are the factors that are influencing the modern synthesis orthodoxy? So, as I said, there are some theoretical assumptions. For example, the exclusion of soft inheritance, that a view of DNA that is focused on the biological inheritance of DNA variations, which of course is very important, but it's not the only kind of variation that is passed, that is inherited. The marginalization of niche construction, they accept niche construction, but they marginalize it. Marginalization of of developmental plasticity, marginalization of the effects of symbiosis, and of the importance of saltational processes in biological evolution. There is a focus on, historically, a focus on sexually reproducing animals with early and rigid germline somal segregation, which had a very, very strong impact on the synthesis. There was most of the architects of the modern synthesis were zoologists. They did take Stebbins, who was, of course, a botanist, and he wrote a book. But when you actually read this book, it doesn't really tally very well with the other books and with the modern synthesis as they saw it. There are a lot of influential textbooks and popular science books that are based on the neo-Darwinian theory that belittle, ridicule, and distort alternative approaches. They are very powerful metaphors, and there is a jargon that is tailored to and is reinforcing the dominant view. There is marginalization, as I said, of anything that contradicts neo-Darwinian paradigm, while there is amplifications of things that are corroborating it. It affects funding policies, less now, but it used to affect them very much. It was very difficult to get a grant. Not that I tried, by the way, I didn't. I didn't play this game, but I know that it was very, very difficult to get a grant for doing work, for example, on epigenetic inheritance. And there were also very few job opportunities. It's much better now. There were also political effects that had an impact on this, on what was going on. There was a Cold War between the USSR, Russia, and the United States, and it spilled into biology. And it led to the disregard in the West of any challenging findings in Russia. I'm not talking about Lysenko. Lysenko was a charlatan, and but there were a lot of honest people in Russia that did fantastic work, but their assumption, they started with very different assumptions from those made in the West, and everything that they did, everything that happened there was completely disregarded. It started shifting a little bit after the wall fall, after the collapse of the USSR. And there were also things that happened in. It's not just the Cold War. It was also the Nazis. There was a very, very thriving tradition of working on plasticity and development and the transgenerational effects of many things in Vienna before the Second World War, and it was an institute that was the biggest private institute for biology. It was called the BVA, and the people in this institute did fantastic work, and there were huge number, there was a lot of work done there and a lot of collaborations with the best scientists all over the world. And it was run by three secular Jewish people, very rich Jewish biologists who gave their money and ran this institute. And when the Nazis came to power, they fired them and installed Nazi scientists, and also undermined this whole research program, which was based on the understanding that the environment can have far-reaching effects on development, which didn't tally very well with the Nazi ideology, which was very hereditary. And the result was that a lot of people left. Some of them were murdered. Some of them emigrated. The whole thing disappeared. Now, why didn't it reappear after the Second World War? It didn't reappear because in Austria, the same Nazi scientists continued very happily to be the leaders of Austrian biology. And it is only now that they are all dead, more or less, that the history is being looked at properly, and the effect, very bad effects, of these people on the development, on the deterioration of biology in Austria is being understood, and also what they did to this whole project. So it's the Nazis on the one hand, and the Stalinists on the other. So between them, so these two factors were very, very important. And okay, so now so let's have a look again at this. So when we're thinking about the networks that are creating this attractor, there are historical factors that we have to look at the top, as well as current ideologies about what is inheritance and what is evolution. And when we're looking at the bottom kind of interactions, we're looking at normative scientific values and scientific beliefs about genetic and the hard nature of heredity, the primacy of the gene, the marginalization of plasticity, and so on and so on. But what you see here is that, yes, there is a dominant attractor, but these assumptions are being undermined. So there is the beginning of the creation of a new attractor to where there is some kind of lowering of the threshold between, you can go also to this alternative attractor now. And it's a very, very interesting kind of phenomenon that we're seeing here at a very, very different level, at the level of, okay, right. So this is the last example that I'm giving. And I want to say I want to bring this into conclusion and to think with you what this landscape metaphor with the 3 levels of networks that we're looking at is allowing us to do. I think it allows us to consider the many factors and the many processes, including institutional, macroeconomic factors, and also biological factors, which sometimes are and sometimes are not important, and depends on the system. So I think it helps us to understand both why things persist and also why they can change. What is that usually in order for things to change, several things have to change. It's not just one kind of magical key that we need in order to change things. It's just the system has to change, and this can happen in many different ways. And how can it change? So we can begin to, once we understand the stability, we can understand that if the network that we're, the kind of landscape that I was describing is always, okay, is always part of a larger network. So if neighboring parts of the social of the focal landscape change, this can induce a change in the focal landscape. For example, the Jewish Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries was affected by what was going on in the Enlightenment movement in Europe in the 18th century. And there can also be internal conflicts within the network, not affected by something that happens outside, but something that happens inside. For example, this is happening at present in Israel. There are 2 groups that are trying to define the. At the moment, we don't have a resolution, but they're trying to define the nature of the kind of the society in which in which we hopefully we're going to live. And communication technologies can have a very big effect on it. Not necessarily they can lead to change, but they can also lead to the stabilization of the current of the attractor. And there can be global changes, like, for example, an epidemic that change in very rapidly many factors altogether, or a big war, like the First World War, for example, that changed the status of women and led to women rights, for voting rights, for example, and other women rights. But it did it because it has changed many factors at the same time at many different levels. So once we understand the things that stabilize the system, we can also, and especially those factors that lead to the positive feedbacks that maintain the system, we can also understand how it is possible to change it. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I just want to finish with the words of Rose, who said that nothing in evolution makes sense except in the light of development. And for humans, neither makes sense except in the light of culture, technology, and human history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's really stimulating. I like in particular the way you brought in Waddington's work, which is very important and often neglected. And that was one of the features of your talk, which I particularly appreciated. Has anybody got a question for Eva?
I hope somebody has a question. It's
Yeah.
not perfect.
Okay. My question to you, Eva, would be, oh, Marian's got a question. Great. Marian, would you come in, please? Marian? Hi.
In the first part of your talk, you mentioned that your background was in genetics.
Yeah.
From that theoretical part of your talk, I would have guessed you give the impression that your background was in developmental biology. No?
Well, my background, I did a PhD in genetics, but my PhD was on X chromosome inactivation. I wanted to understand how a chromosome can get all inactivated. Yeah, and what I was looking at methylation, DNA methylation. I'm talking about the very early 80s. That's when right. So I was looking at DNA methylation, and I was playing with changing the methylation in cell lines of the cells, including the X chromosome. I was using a demethylating agent and looking at the way that it affects. In my case, time of replication of the inactive X chromosome. So I was looking at epigenetic effects, but basically but I come from a genetic background. I mean, I did my PhD in the genetic department, in the Department of Genetics. So, and this work on the developmental cell heredity within development, not between developments, but within development of the inactive and active X chromosome, was one of the things that made me think about the possibility of epigenetic inheritance of epigenetic variations between generations, not only within generations, but also between generations. And so yes, my background is both genetics and in developmental, and I was very interested in developmental biology. I came to biology actually because I read Waddington at the ripe age of 17.
The second part of your, can I ask another question, Jeffrey?
Yes, please go ahead.
The second part of your talk, I'm a sociologist, so it kind of came across as kind of a liberal sociologist kind of thing. One of the problems that the people interested in Darwinian cultural or sociocultural evolution, whatever, economic, whatever you want to call it, one of the difficulties we've had is with developmentalists. That is, there was a long tradition in sociology and macro social change theories that were developmental, and they emphasize that, it goes back to Spencer and up to modern sociologists like a lot of them. And their general theory of social change was social change is a matter of growth, the differentiation, the coming into existence of differences, and functional integration. So they emphasized almost exclusively cooperation rather than conflict being involved, and so part of being a Darwinian in the social sciences has been fighting against developmental social science. So that the blurring of them all is a little bit difficult for some of us.
Well, I think, that a lot of sociologists, as you know better than I do, have a very big problem with sociobiology on the one hand and memetics on the other hand. They don't think that this does justice to what they see as the system, as the sociology as they understand it. I'm talking mainly about qualitative work in sociology.
Oh, yeah.
About meaning making, all these kind of processes. How do they come to be? Can you really explain them as kind of transmission of memes and selection of memes? Can you really explain them all just by innate kind of tendencies that you inherit and that sort of lead you with an iron hand towards certain kind of preferences and so on? It is obviously not very satisfactory. And this is one of the reasons that I was looking for something that is very, very different. I'm not naive. I think conflict is very much part. I have given you an example of conflict, of an ongoing conflict that is going on. For example, in my society, I'm not trying to say that it is not a conflict. It is not based exactly on cooperation. Also, if you're thinking about all kinds of vicious cycles of deprivation, if you're thinking about the cycles of sexual violence, for example, or poverty, there is nothing very cooperative, not necessarily cooperative there. There are feedback loops, yes. There are negative and positive feedback loops, and we have to look at them. We have to look at the system properties of this thing. And I think this is very much something that sociologists could actually can be important for them. And I think that it is a way of making them engaged, sociologists, engaged with biologists, working together, without them feeling that the biologists are trying to sort of force upon them their own views of how biological evolution is supposed to go, which are very often very naive. And a lot of these people who are talking about how social evolution, as I told you, I think that many views of neo-Darwinism are extremely naive and extremely restricted and misleading.
Is part of your message that Waddington was really right all along?
No, I don't think he was right all along. I think well, let me put it this way. First of all, I just want to make clear that Waddington did not think about epigenetic inheritance. He thought that cultural evolution was important in humans. He didn't think that there was inheritance of developmental variations in other organisms. He just didn't think so. I can give you a citation from his from what he wrote. When he was thinking about epigenetics, he was thinking about systems. And I think that the system approach in biology is enormously important. I don't think it's the only way that we can think and should think about a system, but it is enormously important. So I think, yes, not for nothing is he considered to be the father of developmental systems biology.
Okay, I'll just throw in one more little thing, and then I'll let others have a chance. Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Okay. It's very useful to think like that.
I think your illustrations are wonderful. The other day I'm working on a paper and talking about a eukaryotic cell dividing in two and talking about all the different things that are in that cell and how the idea that the two of them would be replicas is absolutely ridiculous. And I think your diagram beautifully illustrates that.
Thank you.
On epigenetic inheritance.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. Roger.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk. That was great. I appreciate your sort of your take on the whatever it's called, the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Yeah, that's not real cool. So I thought those were great remarks. On systems view, totally got to take a systems view. But at the same time, I'm not sure how much I'm getting your real vision. Let's take an example, the poverty trap. So you mentioned social structural factors. That's a big one for me. The schools are such an ongoing scandal. There's the so-called benefits cliff in welfare systems. You start to earn a little money for yourself, and suddenly you lose more in benefits than you gain in your new occupation, or that you gain from getting a raise at work. And on and on. I mean, it's just like, the poor folks are systematically, many populations of poor folks are systematically excluded from the market. I think that's a big deal. So, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, except that we won't let you because we won't let you in the market. Wait a minute, so that's all a big deal for me. I don't understand, but you seem to be saying that somehow the biological epigenetic factors are important. I couldn't understand if you're saying they're more important than the structural factors, or just also important. And
right.
And then let me finish the question, and then I'll be happy to. They're eager to hear the response. How do I sort of, what's my epistemic standard for weighing these different 1, 2, 3 type of considerations? That's it.
Look, I'm not first of all, thank you very much for this, because it allows me to clarify something which is very, very important. When I say that there are epigenetic factors that are important, I mean that if, for example, you take a population of people that eat very, very bad food, there is a lot of violence, there is a lot of drugs, there are a lot of there's all kinds of toxins in the water and so on. And this is something that there's a lot of they live in very polluted, very often very polluted areas. This is very, very bad for health. And this is very, very bad also for cognitive and emotional development. A lot of people who are stressed very early on develop all kinds of cognitive and emotional problems. This is a fact. We cannot ignore this fact. So if you are taking a population of people who for a substantial amount of time are exposed to this kind of factors, this will have an effect on their development unless something is done about it. Now, fortunately, the point about doing something is not only taking away the bad factors. You have to do one of the things that we are learning from work on rats, for example, or mice that have been that the mother have been stressed enormously for while she was pregnant or during early development, and then the F1 generation, F2 generation, sometimes even the F3 generations are suffering. Now, you can reverse it, but you don't reverse it by just not giving the same kind of stresses. You have to reverse it by enriching the environment in particular ways, right? And we have to know this kind of things. So, of course, this kind of epigenetic factors have an effect. We cannot ignore them. They can be reversed. I think it's more difficult in many, and they are related also to the social factors, to the kind of more structural factors at the social level, of the welfare system, of all kinds of the neighborhood segregation, of the stigmas that and prejudices that exist in society. These things are all, they're intertwined. But what I'm trying to say is that when we're thinking about the social, about human beings, sometimes, not always, I mean, when we're thinking about a question such as why do we have this kind of theoretical attractor in evolutionary biology, of course we don't need to think about the epigenetics of the people who are constructing it. It's completely irrelevant. This is the wrong level of analysis. But in the case of urban poverty, I think it is something that we have to pay attention to. And we have to be actively, to be engaged actively, because it is possible to change it and reverse it completely with, so we have to do it. But we have to know that we have to do it.
Roger, do you want a quick return on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was right with you until you said we have to do something about it. And I wonder who we is. I would remind everyone that we are apes, and and apes act apishly. So we're an unusual ape. We have reverse dominance hierarchies, et cetera, but the long evolutionary history of dominance hierarchies is still within us. So what do you mean by we have to do something about it? Now, if you let the community, if there's a black church even in the poorest and centers of the city, etc. So there are restorative and social institutions in civil society to provide the sort of cultivation that you're talking about, and I totally agree with you on that. But then when you say we, yeah, that's my question. Who is we? How are you going to do that? How are you going to solve the ape problem?
Well, we're finding apes, aren't we? I'm thinking about the Green Movement, for example. One of the things that really helped the Green Movement was the book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. It made a big deal. It made a big difference. The silly companies made a mistake in this case. Instead of staying silent about it, they wrote and demonized her and wrote against her, so the book became interesting to people. And it was very instrumental in pushing the Green Movement, making people simply aware of what is going on. A lot of people are not aware of what is going on. A lot of people are feeling that they have no power to act and to influence anybody. Now, we all can do very little, each of us individually. But I think that when I'm thinking about we, I mean, we have to have the goodwill and the wish to also share with other people what we think can help. And this is what I'm talking about we. So not everybody will do it, and there will be always conflicting interests in people's lives. Yes, but nevertheless, things do change sometimes for the better. And they change for the better because a lot of people fight for them. It's not a miracle,
Okay.
right? If you're thinking about the women movement, right? If
Okay, yeah, Jan Willem. Jan Willem?
Yes,
Right.
there I am. Thank you very much for your talk, Eva. I wanted to ask you a question coming at it from basically my own field, which is within economics, mostly business and organizations like firms. And you, at some point, you were talking about heritable variable traits, if I remember correctly.
heritable variable traits, yeah.
And I was wondering a little bit when I heard that concept, and when you later talked about attractors and gave your different examples, if or if not, that concept or those two concepts, heritable variable traits on the one hand and the attractors in your examples on the other, how would you say that relates to the notion that evolutionary interested people have been using a lot when they talk about firms or other collectives? And the notion that is used there very often is the idea of routines. And the idea of routines is that there's, some collective enacting certain learned repeated behaviors. Is that also what these heritable variable traits are about, but then at a collective level, and is or is not in your different examples? Are these attractors, are they also examples of these sorts of behavior patterns? Is that what is in the middle? Is that what you're trying to explain? And is then a developmental notion how these things are on the one hand stable but may still change over time?
Yes, what I'm trying to say is that the routines that you're talking about are relatively stable. I mean, I had another example in my talk about which I didn't mention, of course, because there was no time, of some kind of ritual, an anthropological example, which is going a little bit. It's not an institution like what you're talking about, but there are also routines there. And when you're thinking generally about yes, so there is the institutions with their routines and with their are contributing to the kind of stability of certain economic behaviors within the society. I couldn't give an example about that because I'm not familiar enough with these cases. I didn't read enough about it. But I guess that you could work out some kind of example showing how the development of institution or institutional routines is constructed. What are the, what goes into the construction, for example, of certain routines? Why are these routines, why certain routines become very, very stable? And what, and and I think this could be interesting. Or you can look at the effect that existing routines have, not at the change of routines or how they're constructed, but at the way that existing routines shape certain economic behaviors. So you can look at both the development of routines themselves, as well as the effect of existing routines. Of course, they are all part of a dynamic system, but nevertheless, we can sort of decide to look at just this part of this part of the system and see how they affect whatever economic behavior we are interested in. I don't know if I answered you.
No, that's very clear. Thank you. But more generally, so across your different examples, you were using this word attractor, and but your examples were relatively different. So is it always in some sense about a stable pattern of behavior that you're trying to explain?
Yes.
In the middle?
Yes.
So including when we're talking about different scientific paradigms like the
Right.
modern synthesis or you would still think of that as a behavior pattern, or?
No, not exactly. In this case, it's not exactly a behavioral pattern. In this case, I'm thinking about why the hell is this paradigm so stable, in spite of the fact that there are so many things that challenge it. What's going on, right? So I'm looking at, and why are people sort of so readily socialized, as scientists, young scientists, socialized into this system? So I'm also looking at the socialization processes that lead to, I mean, after all, this is not done in the air, it's done by human beings who are writing papers, who are arguing with other people and so on. And they are socialized into a certain system, and I want to understand why and how they are socialized into this system. And so how this paradigm is constructed in this case. So this is kind of behavioral at a very meta level.
So would that in some sense be at a higher level of analysis than the other example?
Yes,
so that it could be sort of a nested type of system?
Yeah, what I was trying to do with this example is to show that you can think about very, very different systems within the framework of this, that this landscape model with the 3 levels is very helpful to think about very, very different systems. I mean, if you're thinking about poverty and, for example, there you get the epigenetic factors may be quite important. But in other systems that I was talking about, they're not important, these epigenetic differences. Other things are important. Psychological, all kinds of early learned social learning is very, very important. And things like that. I mean, this is a different, you start with a different level of analysis. And in each case, you have to be very specific and very, very careful about what exactly you're talking about. This is the most difficult thing to do with this kind of system. Exactly what factors are you talking about? What is the level of analysis that you're choosing?
Maybe very quickly to conclude that I'm getting a sense that there is a link between what you're showing us and sort of the way to think about this with this Waddington landscape metaphor or model, with multi-level selection type of theories and major transitions and evolution. And so in some sense, what your last remark there was also, we need to sort of be clear for ourselves what the layered ontology is and how we get through multi-level selection processes, how we can get to higher layers of organization and understand their stability and change, and how they have feedback on lower levels, and how still higher levels can sort of through major transitions can come about. Does that make any sense? Or
yes, I think that this is very important. I think that what I was trying to say also, I mean, this is part of you are absolutely right. We have to think about multi-level selection. We have to think about selection processes at each of these levels can happen in many, many different ways. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that usually when we think about selection, we think about some kind of replicating entities. But we don't have to think about, but there is also something that we can call differential persistence. And differential persistence within a system doesn't depend on selection. For example, if we think about neural networks, some neural networks persist more or less, not because they are replicated within the brain, but because connections are being strengthened and some connections are being weakened. Right. So when we're thinking about evolution in general, I think we have to think both about replicating entities, but also about differential persistence of the systems in which these replicating entities exist and operate. So we have to think about these two things. And I think that the neglect of differential persistence and the networks and the feedbacks and the complicated kind of interactions that go into them has been neglected by people who were thinking in terms of either sociobiology or in terms of mimetics. And I think and for sociologists, it's very important to understand these networks. A lot of them, this is what they're mostly interested in. I think you have to do both.
I think you just reconciled Jeff and me. in terms of one of our
Absolutely.
major differences. I always say it's retention, not so much replication. And Jeff says, no, it's replication, not retention. Anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think you're
Thank you
right,
very
Jan.
much,
Well,
Eva. Thank you.
The attractor is very important for me, and this is very, very much a notion of retention.
yeah, retention
Related.
and replication are important. We all agree on that. So thanks very much, everyone, for the discussion, and thanks in particular, Eva, for a really stimulating talk. It's been great to have you. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the next meeting. So
Thank you very much.